The best World Cup performance of every country in the world, part 2. If you still haven't seen part 1, there's a link in the description to take you there. We've got a long way to go yet, so let's just get stuck in. We finished the last video with France, and just to the north lies Belgium, who have reached the semi-finals in both 1986 and 2018, being knocked out by the eventual winners on both occasions. They've spent much of the last few years at the top of the FIFA rankings and are the only country that's never won a World Cup to have done so. Another French-speaking nation can be found on the other side of the world in New Caledonia. As one of the better Oceanian sides, currently ranked 3rd in the region, the closest they came to beating New Zealand to the playoff spot was in 2010, finishing 7 points behind the Kiwis. Sitting 3rd in the CONCACAF rankings is Panama. They finally qualified for their first World Cup in 2018 at the 11th time of asking. A tough draw put them up against Belgium and England, and they failed to pick up a single point. Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking nation in Africa, are yet to qualify for a World Cup. But last year, they finished just 2 points off going through to the final playoff round, and this year, after having been drawn in a group with Tunisia again, they've won both of their 2 opening games. They could be one of the African debutants we see in 2026. Another strong candidate is Burkina Faso, the second highest ranked African side never to qualify. The closest they came was definitely 2014 when finishing top of a second round group containing Congo, Gabon and Niger set up a playoff with Algeria. They won the home leg 3-2, but losing 1-0 in Algeria meant their opponents qualified on away goals. In my video explaining 2026 qualifying, the simulation we ran actually ended up with Burkina Faso going all the way to the final African playoff, but were knocked out. There were 5 other teams who made their World Cup debut though, some a bit more mental than the rest. Cyprus first participated in World Cup qualifying back in 1962, but their best effort was probably in 1998. A draw with Russia and wins over Israel and Luxembourg gave them 10 points, 7 away from the playoff place. Consistently one of the best teams in Asia, Iraq qualified for their first World Cup in 1986. If it weren't for war and the torture of players, they probably would have qualified for at least 1 or 2 more since. But Mexico 86 is their only finals appearance to date, where they lost by just 1 goal to all 3 of Mexico, Paraguay and Belgium to end up bottom of their group. After losing a playoff match to Portugal in 2010, Bosnia and Herzegovina then went on to finish top of their group in 2014 qualifying to win their ticket to Brazil. Narrowly losing to Argentina and Iran meant they were already knocked out before playing the final game, which they would go on to win 3-1. Tahiti conceded 24 goals in their 3 games of the 2013 Confederations Cup when they became the only Oceania nation apart from New Zealand and Australia to qualify. They're yet to repeat that feat at the World Cup, but the closest they've come was in 2002, finishing 3 points behind New Zealand and failing to advance to the playoff match with Australia. Another absolutely stunning Caribbean flag is that of St Vincent and the Grenadines, who first entered World Cup qualifying in 1994, 13 years after gaining independence from the UK. In 2002, they kicked off their campaign with a 14-1 win on aggregate over the US Virgin Islands and will go on to reach the penultimate round, in which they lost all 6 games and scored just 2 goals. Ranked 179th in the world, Cambodia have only won a total of 4 games in their 7 World Cup qualifying campaigns. 2 of those came in 2022, winning both the legs in their first round tie against Pakistan. They could only muster 1 draw against Hong Kong in the second round and suffered a 10-0 defeat to Iran at home, followed by a 14-0 defeat away. Montserrat is the least populous FIFA nation with just under 5,000 inhabitants. There's actually more people subscribed to this YouTube channel than live in Montserrat. You wouldn't know that on the pitch though, as they're ranked higher than 10 other CONCACAF sides. In 2022, a respectable 1-1 draw with El Salvador left them just 2 points away from round 2, probably their best attempt so far. The most recent country to join the list of World Cup winners was Spain in 2010. 1-0 wins against Portugal, Paraguay and Germany set up a final with the Netherlands, where an Iniesta goal in extra time allowed them to lift their first World Cup trophy. Apart from that, the best they've managed was 4th in the 1950 final round, and arguably a country with the footballing calibre of Spain should have achieved a lot more than that. That quarter-final win over Paraguay actually ended their best run ever. 2010 was the 4th World Cup in a row for which Paraguay had qualified, and they finished top of their group with Slovakia, New Zealand and Italy. They would then beat Japan on penalties after a 0-0 draw, and then, as we just mentioned, lose 1-0 to Spain. They only scored 3 goals all tournament, but it's the furthest they've got so far. Our first nation in the Caucasus over the 2 videos is Armenia. Another former Soviet state, their first qualification campaign wouldn't come until 1998, and the closest they've come to a final tournament was probably during the last campaign, where they finished 4th and just 6 points off of North Macedonia in the playoff place. Latvia, also a former Soviet state, are yet to come as close as they were to qualifying back in 1938. They beat Lithuania over 2 legs in the first round and then lost to Austria 2-1 in the final round. Curiously, as Germany invaded Austria, their teams were merged, meaning there was 1 slot free at the World Cup finals. FIFA offered that spot to England, who refused, meaning there were only 15 teams at the final tournament. Looking back, it seems a little bit harsh that this last spot wasn't offered to Latvia. It looks like the Cayman Islands decided to put their own spin on the disabled lion from the old Norwich badge, but even that can't distract from their winless World Cup record. 7 campaigns, 20 games, 0 wins. They came close in 2018 though, only losing to Belize on away goals after a 1-1 draw in the second leg. To the west, we have Honduras. Only 3 CONCACAF teams have qualified for more World Cups than them, but they've failed to really make a name for themselves in any of their 3 finals appearances, being knocked out in the group stage each time without winning a single game. In 1982, however, they did manage draws against both Spain and Northern Ireland, ending up just 1 point behind second. At the same World Cup, Algeria were pretty much cheated out of advancing to the second group stage. After Algeria won their final game against Chile, West Germany and Austria played the day after, and they knew that a German win by 1 or 2 goals would guarantee that both sides advanced to the next round. So Austria just let West Germany score, and then the 2 sides passed the ball around meaninglessly for the rest of the game. 32 years later, Algeria would get their chance to advance from the group stage, where in the round of 16, they took the eventual winners Germany to extra time, only to lose 2-1. The Republic of Congo, unlike their democratic brothers, are yet to qualify for a World Cup. But in 1998, they beat Ivory Coast in the first round to advance to their final round group, where they finished just 3 points away from going to France. The least populous nation to ever qualify for a World Cup is the Atlantic islands of Iceland. Having qualified for their first ever Euros in 2016, they went one better 2 years later and qualified for their first ever World Cup. They kicked off the tournament by coming from behind to draw 1-1 with Argentina, but then lost to both Nigeria and Croatia to be sent home. As the youngest UEFA side, Kosovo have participated in just 2 qualifying campaigns. In 2018, they finished bottom with just 1 point, and last time round they also finished bottom, but they did manage to pick up an away win at Georgia. After the withdrawal of literally everyone else in their region, Cuba qualified for the 1938 World Cup in France. After a 3-3 draw with Romania in the round of 16, they then won the replay 2-1, setting up a quarter-final against Sweden, which they lost 8-0. Since then, of course, Cuba haven't qualified for any more World Cups, which by my reckoning is the joint longest World Cup drought of every team to ever play at a finals. Great name, great flag, it can only be Antigua and Barbuda. Most of their qualification campaigns have been what you'd expect from a nation of their size, but in 2014 they had a really good go at it, topping their second round group of Haiti, Curacao and the US Virgin Islands. In round 3 they managed to draw against Jamaica at home and avoided any heavy defeats against decent opposition, but eventually finished bottom with just 1 point. Whilst they're by no means a bad side nowadays, it's unlikely Hungary will reach the levels of their golden era of the 30s and 50s again anytime soon. In 1938, they reached the final where they were beaten 4-2 by reigning champions Italy. They didn't actually enter the 1950 World Cup, but 4 years later they would again reach the final after some incredible results. They won 9-0 against South Korea and 8-3 against West Germany in the group stage, and then beat both Brazil and Uruguay 4-2 to set up another game against West Germany in the final. After 8 minutes, they were 2-0 up, but eventually lost 3-2. Since then, the best they've managed is a couple quarterfinals, and they haven't even qualified since 1986. One of the 16 invitees for the 1930 World Cup was Thailand, then known as Siam, but they withdrew. They wouldn't enter World Cup qualifying until 1970, and in 2002 they finished bottom of their final round group, probably the closest they've come. If we just look at population, Bangladesh are one of the biggest underperformers in world football. Although they're the 8th most populous country, they sit 183rd in the world rankings. The first World Cup they attempted to qualify for was Mexico '86, and that was their best campaign to date. 2 wins over Indonesia and Thailand left them 5 points away from advancing to round 2. Just like the other 2 Baltic nations, Lithuania's best attempt at World Cup qualification came before they were part of the Soviet Union. In 1934, after losing 2-0 to Sweden, no one could be asked to play the Estonia-Lithuania game as it wasn't possible for either of them to qualify. If they had managed to beat Sweden and then beat Estonia by enough goals to outdo Sweden's goal average, they would have gone to the World Cup in Italy. Namibia's first qualifying campaign came in 1994, just after they gained independence from South Africa. In the run-up to the last World Cup, they beat Eritrea in the first round, but Senegal's 11-point advantage in the second round stopped them advancing to the playoff. With just 2 wins in qualifying to their name, Mauritania have never really been serious competition for the other African sides. One of those wins was over South Sudan in 2014, which meant they advanced to the second round for the first time in their history. Tunisia, then ranked 4th in Africa, beat them 4-2 over the 2 legs. The third and final African African Guinea in this list is simply called Guinea. Ranked 3 places above Equatorial Guinea, they're regulars in the knockout stages of AFCON. On several occasions, they've just missed out on going to a World Cup, such as in 1998, where 1 point was all that separated themselves and Nigeria, forcing the Ghanaians to watch the finals on the telly. Just to the southwest, we have Gambia, who in the years they've had to play in the first round have never managed to advance to round 2. But in 2010, a different format was used, and everyone apart from the 10 lowest ranked teams went straight into round 2. In their group with both Algeria and Senegal, they finished second and were just 1 point short of first. Pretty good going. Out of the 12 groups, the 8 best runners-up also advanced to the third round, but as there were some groups of just 3 teams, results against the 4th place side in each group didn't count, and that meant that Gambia were knocked out on goal difference. St. Lucia are one of the better small Caribbean nations when it comes to football, ranked 20th in the CONCACAF region, above the likes of Cuba and Bermuda. In 2006, they battered the British Virgin Islands 10-0 over 2 legs, but crumbled at the hands of Panama in round 2, losing 7-0. As mentioned in the previous video, Slovakia reached the round of 16 back in 2010, but the other team to come out of the breakup of Czechoslovakia have never got past the group stage. The Czech Republic beat Norway in a playoff to qualify for the 2006 World Cup, which they kicked off with a 3-0 win over America, but losing 2-0 to both Ghana and Italy meant they were knocked out with 3 points. The most improved team over the last few years in Europe, if not the world, has been North Macedonia. They had never really mounted a serious qualification attempt for any major tournament until 2020, where they qualified for the Euros. 2 years later, they managed to beat Germany in the group to help them on their way to the playoffs, where they were drawn into a tough semi-final against Italy. Remarkably, they scored a 92nd minute winner to set up a final with Portugal, which they lost 2-0. Costa Rica are by far and away the most successful Central American nation at World Cups, qualifying for a total of 6 finals. In 2014, they surpassed everyone's expectations by topping Group D, containing Uruguay, Italy and England, all previous World Cup winners. They then beat Greece on penalties to advance to the quarterfinals, where they had to go through another penalty shootout against the Netherlands, which they lost 4-3. Despite a poor start, Slovenia qualified for their first World Cup in 2002 after just beating out their former Yugoslavian compatriots to a playoff spot, but they were a bit more successful at the 2010 World Cup. Beating Algeria and then drawing with America meant they were top of their group going into the final game, but a 1-0 defeat to England stopped them from advancing to the knockout stages. 4 years later, in 2014, the Dominican Republic enjoyed their best ever World Cup qualification campaign. As they prefer baseball over football, the Dominicans were actually ranked lower than the likes of the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, forcing them to play a preliminary round match against Anguilla, which they won 6-0. In their second round group, they couldn't get near El Salvador's 100% record, ending their hopes of going to Brazil. Whilst they haven't qualified for any major tournament since 2000, it would be a shame to not see Erling Haaland get a chance to play with Norway at a World Cup. Their last appearance in 1998 saw them beat the reigning champions Brazil in the group stage to advance to a round of 16 tie against Italy. Their 1-0 defeat in that game has been followed by a 26-year World Cup drought. The current qualification campaign is only the 6th that the Philippines national team has entered. There's a long way to go yet, so they still could make it their best, but they'd have to beat their 2022 performance, where wins over Guam and the Maldives gave them 11 points, 8 short of second place to China. Bahrain are one of the best Asian teams yet to qualify for a World Cup, but on 2 separate occasions they've come within an inch of qualifying for the finals. In 2006, they lost 2-1 to Trinidad and Tobago in the CONCACAF AFC playoff, and 4 years later, their campaign consisting of 20 games over 5 rounds culminated in a playoff against the OFC representative New Zealand. A 0-0 draw in the home leg was followed by a 1-0 defeat in Wellington. In 1982, just before George Weah came onto the scene, Liberia entered World Cup qualifying for the first time, but their best campaign came in 2002, just before Weah's retirement. After edging past Chad in round 1, they finished just 1 point off first place Nigeria in the final round to deny them their first appearance at a World Cup. Speaking of Nigeria, who are currently ranked 3rd in Africa, they've reached the round of 16 in 3 out of their 6 World Cup appearances. In all 3 of those, they lost to European opposition, and in 1994, it took the eventual runners-up Italy to extra time, only to be knocked out by a Roberto Baggio penalty. The last 2 letters in Nigeria are clearly very important, because if you take them off, you're left with Niger, who have never qualified for a World Cup. Their second attempt in 1982 was probably their best. They scraped past both Somalia and Togo on away goals, only to lose 4-1 to Algeria in the penultimate round. Just 2 more wins would have sent them to Spain. Malta are the 4th lowest ranked side in Europe, and they've won just 3 out of their 112 games in World Cup qualifying. One of those wins came in 2022 over Cyprus, and picking up 2 draws, including one away at Slovakia, gave them their best ever points tally of 5. In 2022, the Cook Islands withdrew from World Cup qualifying, but 4 years earlier came the best out of their 6 campaigns so far. Coming into the first round, ranked 206th in the world, the lowest in Oceania, they managed to beat both Tonga and Samoa, ending up as one of the 3 teams on 6 points. Samoa's superior goal difference was all that kept the Cook Islands from progressing to round 2 for the first time. The first non-European country on our list where Dutch is an official language is the islands of Curacao. Back in the day, they were lumped together with Aruba to form the Netherlands Antilles, and were one of the first Caribbean sides to enter World Cup qualifying. In 1962, after beating Suriname in the first round, they were only 2 points off Mexico in round 2, which stops them from advancing to the final playoff match against the CONMEBOL representative. Currently ranked 91st in the world and 10th in CONCACAF, they're arguably the best North American side yet to play at a World Cup. Due to the ongoing war, Palestine are having to play their home games in Kuwait. In spite of that fact, it's looking likely that they'll progress to the third round in the current qualifying campaign. They're 5 points clear of Lebanon with just 2 games to go. In the third round, they'll only need to finish in the top 4 of their group to avoid elimination, which probably makes this their best chance yet of qualifying. I don't really need to explain anything here. Brazil are just pretty bloody good, and they always have been. They're the only team to have played at every single World Cup and have only failed to get past the first round twice, in 1930 and 1934. Since then, they've lifted the trophy 5 times, the most out of anyone, and have finished as runners-up on 2 other occasions. Since their last title in 2002, however, they haven't reached the final once, and during the current qualifying campaign, they're making a bit of a meal of it, managing only 7 points from their first 6 games, which only just puts them in the top 6. If they fail to qualify this year of all years, that would surely be the biggest disgrace in football history. Pakistan have played 38 games across 10 World Cup qualifying campaigns, and they've won a grand total of 1. That came last year in the second leg of a first round match against Cambodia, taking Pakistan to the second round of AFC qualifying for the first time in their history. They've gone on to lose all 4 games they've played so far, mathematically eliminating them. A very similar country in footballing terms is Somalia. They're only 3 places behind Pakistan in the world rankings and the second lowest in Africa. Like Pakistan, they've got just 1 World Cup qualifying win under their belt, which came in the form of a 1-0 win over Zimbabwe in the first leg of round 1. The second leg was lost 3-1, however, meaning Somalia were eliminated. In 1950, Syria became the 3rd modern-day AFC nation to play in World Cup qualifying, where they were spanked 7-0 by Turkey. 68 years later, in 2018, after finishing 3rd in their second-round group, they only had to beat Australia to set up an inter-confederation playoff against Honduras. Unfortunately, due to circumstances off the pitch, they were having to play their home games in Malaysia, which is actually closer to Australia. Despite that, the game was held at 2-2 on aggregate as it went into extra time, where Tim Cahill would break Syrian hearts with a goal in the 109th minute. Lesotho have made a decent start to the current qualifying campaign, avoiding defeat against both Benin and Nigeria. Their only wins to date came in 2014, beating Burundi 3-2 in the first round and finishing 10 points off the top in round 2. At 86th in the world, Bolivia are the worst CONMEBOL nation according to the FIFA rankings. Despite that, they've qualified 3 World Cups, although they only had to play in qualifying for 1 of them. In both 1930 and 1950, they lost all of their group games without scoring a single goal, and it wasn't until 1994 where they picked up a 0-0 draw against South Korea and scored a solitary goal against Spain. There's only one Ethiopian qualification campaign that stands out from the rest, and that was in 2014. In the first round, they eased past neighbours Somalia 5-0 and then beat out South Africa to top their second round group, making them by far the lowest ranked side in the third round. If they could beat Nigeria, they'd be on a plane to Brazil the following summer. Despite going 1-0 up in the first leg, they eventually lost 4-1. Currently ranked 145th in the world, they may never come that close again. Given their population, their love for football, the duration of their FIFA affiliation, and the fact they've hosted the bloody thing twice, it is absolutely incredible that Mexico have never managed to get past the quarterfinals of the World Cup. Their 2 quarterfinals were on home soil, losing to the eventual runners-up on both occasions. After their ban in 1990, they then reached the round of 16 7 times in a row before being knocked out in the group stage last time round. The lowest ranked of the 3 Caucasus nations is Azerbaijan, and there's only 1 qualifying campaign in which they've managed to win more than 1 game. Beating San Marino twice and Norway once in 2018 helps them on their way to 10 points. In 2016, the Chinese FA announced their plan to become a world football superpower by 2050. We'll wait and see if that comes to pass, but so far China have only ever qualified once for a World Cup. In 2002, they finished first in the final round of qualifying to be drawn into a group with Brazil, Turkey and Costa Rica, where they lost all 3 games without scoring a single goal. Currently ranked second in Asia, Iran have qualified for 6 World Cups, including the last 3 in a row. Unfortunately, they've failed to get past the group stage every time. In 2018, they did well to finish with 4 points in a group with Spain, Portugal and Morocco, but it wasn't quite enough to send them to the round of 16. After playing as part of Yugoslavia and subsequently Serbia and Montenegro first attempted to qualify for a World Cup in 2010. Their best campaign was probably 2018, where a 1-0 win away at Denmark helped them on their way to 16 points, just 4 off of a playoff spot. Uzbekistan are the highest ranked Asian team yet to qualify, at 66th in the world. Twice have they reached the final playoff round of AFC qualifying. The first was lost on away goals to Bahrain, who went on to lose to Trinidad and Tobago in the Interconfederation playoff, and they lost the second 9-8 on penalties to Jordan, who were then beaten by Uruguay. They're already guaranteed to advance to the third round in 2026 qualification, so we may well see them make their debut in North America. A 12-0 win against Mongolia during 2006 AFC qualifying remains the Maldives' biggest ever victory, and it saw them advance to the second round. A respectable 0-0 draw with South Korea and a victory over Vietnam was nowhere near enough to see them go to round 3, and that was where their journey ended. The best World Cup performance of Morocco is probably very fresh in everyone's memory, a performance which has put them up to 12th in the world rankings. Going into Qatar, they had only reached the knockout stages once, but they then topped their group of Croatia, Belgium and Canada before defeating Spain on penalties and Portugal 1-0 in the quarters. That set up a semi-final against the holders France, which proved to be one step too far. The second to last former Soviet state on this list is Moldova, who, like many smaller European sides, had their best qualifying campaign when they were lucky enough to be drawn in the same group as San Marino. Their guaranteed 6 points, along with a win against Montenegro and draws Poland and Ukraine, left them sitting on 11 points. As one of the 2 South American nations that don't play in CONMEBOL, Guyana haven't seen much success in any of their CONCACAF qualifying campaigns. In 2014 though, they didn't have a bad go at it, beating out Trinidad and Tobago to top their second round group, put them through to the third round for the first time. But they only managed to pick up 1 point against El Salvador. Congratulations are in order for all the Georgians, as they've just managed to qualify for their first ever Euros after beating former champions Greece on penalties. One day they may repeat that feat for the World Cup, but so far the closest they've come was back in 2002, where they were 6 points behind Romania in the playoff spot. Probably the least remembered World Cup participant is Indonesia, who back in 1938 was still known as the Dutch East Indies. After Japan withdrew from qualifying, Indonesia qualified by default and were drawn against Hungary in the first round. They can't be too disappointed with losing 6-0 to one of the best teams in the world at the time, but 86 years have now passed without them returning to the big stage, which alongside Cuba is the joint longest drought of anyone. One of the 2 nations that shares the islands of Borneo with Indonesia is Brunei, who were beaten 12-0 by Indonesia to knock them out of this year's AFC qualifying. They've never got through to the second round and only have 2 wins to their name. Those come in games they lost on aggregate against Chinese Taipei and Mongolia. Another tasty Caribbean flag is that of Barbados, who first entered World Cup qualifying in 1978. Their best campaign to date was by far and away in 2002, where they beat Grenada, Aruba and then Cuba on penalties on their way to the penultimate round. They somehow won their opening game of the group against Costa Rica with an 89th minute winner, but lost all of their remaining fixtures and finished bottom. Ireland had to wait until 1990 for their first taste of a World Cup finals, where they finished second in an incredibly dull group of England, the Netherlands and Egypt. Just 7 goals were scored in the 6 games. They then beat Romania on penalties after a 0-0 draw and were beaten 1-0 by hosts Italy in the quarterfinals. Even though they didn't win a single game in 90 minutes and scored just 2 goals, that is their best World Cup so far. They also qualified in 1994 and 2002 and got out their group both times, making them one of the few teams to never be knocked out in the group stage. Having previously only won 1 game in World Cup qualifying, Zimbabwe surprised everyone in 1994. They beat Egypt, who had qualified 4 years earlier, to top their first round group unbeaten, and then were drawn with Cameroon and Guinea in the final round. Going into their last game away at Cameroon, the 2 were level on points, but a 3-1 loss ended Zimbabwe's best effort so far. It would take Nicaragua over 40 years to finally enter World Cup qualifying after becoming a FIFA member in 1950, and they didn't win a game until 2014. Their best campaign was probably 2018, when they beat Anguilla 8-0 in the first round, Suriname 4-1 in the second, before being defeated 4-3 by Jamaica to stop them advancing to the penultimate round. 6 times have they qualified for a World Cup, and 6 times have they failed to get past the group stage. It must be painful being a Tunisian, but their best effort was probably last time round in Qatar, where a draw with Denmark and a win over eventual runners-up France left them just 2 points off a spot in the round of 16. Out of all the countries on this list with a Union Jack in the top left corner of their flag, Bermuda is the only one not to go with a blue background. At 171st in the world, they're a better side than many other CONCACAF nations, and in 1994 they beat Haiti and Antigua and Barbuda to reach the penultimate round, where they were just 3 points short of staying in the competition. After a 36-year absence, Canada returned to the world stage by qualifying for the finals in Qatar, which turned out to be a marginally better appearance than their first in 1986. After losing their first game against Belgium 1-0, and Alphonso Davies' goal put them in front against 2018 runners-up Croatia. Unfortunately, they then conceded 4 goals, which knocks them out and rendered their last game meaningless. Suriname are the other South American nation to play in CONCACAF, and they sit 13 places above their neighbours Guyana in the rankings. Back in 1970, they had a bit of a funkier flag, and they kicked off that year's qualifying with a 6-0 win over the Netherlands Antilles. That win was followed by a 6-0 loss to El Salvador, who finished with 2 more points and went on to qualify for the finals in Mexico. At the 1978 World Cup, Peru tops their group containing Iran, Scotland and the Netherlands, and that put them through to the second group stage, where the top team in each group goes on to play the final. Following a 6-0 defeat to Argentina on the final day, which allowed the Argentines to go through on goal difference, Peru were actually accused of accepting bribes. True or not, topping their first round group makes 1978 Peru's best appearance at a World Cup. There's only one North African country yet to qualify for a World Cup, and that's Libya, who are way behind their neighbours in the FIFA rankings at 120th. Their best qualifying campaign was probably in 2006, where they eased past Sao Tome and Principe in the first round, only to finish 10 points away from qualifying in a tough second round group. Going into the final day of CONCACAF qualifying for the 2006 World Cup, Guatemala still had a chance of qualifying. If they beat Costa Rica and Trinidad and Tobago failed to beat Mexico, that would have sent them to the Interconfederation playoff. They did their part with a 3-1 win, but Trinidad coming from behind to beat Mexico ended Guatemala's dreams. Out of all the countries who have won the Euros, Greece have qualified for the least World Cups. At the time of their shock win over Portugal, the only World Cup they had played was the 1994 edition. This century, they've qualified for 2 more, and in 2014 they managed to get out of their group and then score a 91st minute equaliser to take Costa Rica to penalties in the round of 16, only to lose 5-3. Since their first 2 appearances, it's been all downhill for Austria at the World Cup. In 1934, they beat France with 2 goals in extra time in the first round and then dispatched Hungary before falling to defeat to the eventual champions, Italy. The next time they graced the world stage, they also reached the semi-finals, losing 6-1 to West Germany, and that came after a 7-5 victory over Switzerland in the quarters, just the 19 goals over the 2 games. Since then, the best they've managed was the group stage in 78 and 82, and they haven't qualified at all this century. Egypt were invited to play at the inaugural World Cup, but due to a storm, they missed their ship to Uruguay. 4 years later though, they qualified after beating Palestine over 2 legs to become the first African country to ever play at a World Cup. They were drawn against Hungary in the first round and lost 4-2, but as Egypt were knocked out in the group stage before even reaching the equivalent round of 16 in the 2 other finals they've qualified for since, that means that 1934 remains the furthest they've ever got at the tournament. They've got a nice kit, a great badge, an unbelievable flag, and they have a real chance of making their debut at the next World Cup. The Solomon Islands is by far my favourite mini nation in football. Their first attempt at qualification came in 1990, and in the following years they've reached the final of OFC qualifying on 3 separate occasions. The first 2 were lost convincingly to Australia and New Zealand over 2 legs, and the last time round they reached the final of the mini tournament in Qatar, only to fall to a 5-0 defeat to once again New Zealand. As the OFC now has 1 guaranteed spot at the 2026 World Cup and 1 Interconfederation playoff spot, the Solomon Islands seem like they have the best chances out of all of the non-New Zealand sides to qualify. They're now the lowest ranked European side who have played at least 1 World Cup, and they haven't qualified since 1998, but they did participate in the majority of the World Cups during the second half of the 20th century, and in 1994 they shocked everyone by beating Mexico and Germany on their way to a semi-final clash against Italy, which they would lose 2-1. A remarkable run considering there were only 4 teams ranked lower than them at the tournament. Ghana had to wait until 2006 for their first World Cup appearance, but since then they've only missed 1 tournament. Their most memorable appearance was of course in South Africa, where they scraped through their group and then beat America in the round of 16 in extra time. That set up one of the most notorious games in World Cup history, where with the scores level in extra time, Uruguay's Luis Suarez used his hand to stop a Ghana winner and was sent off. Asamoah Gyan would then fire his penalty off the crossbar, allowing Uruguay to win the game on penalties. Those events stopped Ghana becoming the first African nation to reach the semi-finals and must still sting for Ghanaians to this very day. Rounding off Central America is Belize, the only English-speaking country in the region and also the worst by some distance. Their best attempt at qualifying came in 2014, where they beat Montserrat 8-3 on aggregate in the first round and picked up a couple of wins to finish second in round 2, but 11 points short of Guatemala in first. I'll now proceed to read a list of all of the times Israel has changed confederation. In 1934, they started in Africa/Asia. In 1938, they switched to Europe. In 1958, they go back to Africa/Asia. In 1962, they go back to Europe. In 1970, they switched to Asia/Oceania. In 1982, they go back to Europe. In 1986, they switched to Oceania. In 1994, they go back to Europe. We won't go into all of the political reasons behind that journey in this video, but somewhere in there, Israel did manage to qualify for a World Cup. That was in 1970 as part of the joint Asia-Oceania region, where North Korea refused to play them, helped them on their way to their final round, in which they beat Australia. Things didn't go terribly in Mexico for the Israelis. They picked up draws against both Sweden and Italy, but those 2 points weren't enough to see them through to the knockout stage. One of the less remembered teams at World Cup finals is Kuwait, who qualified for Spain '82 after topping their final round qualifying group of New Zealand, China and Saudi Arabia. They managed a respectable draw with Czechoslovakia, but the most memorable moment came when the brother of Kuwait's reigning monarch came down from the stands to protest the controversial French goal, which the ref subsequently annulled. Colombia are arguably the biggest underachievers in South America. With the second largest population and some incredibly passionate fans, I feel like Colombia should have at least reached one semi-final by now. In 2014, they dominated their group and then beat Uruguay 2-0 in the round of 16 to set up a quarter-final against host Brazil, which they lost 2-1. That's the only time they've ever reached the quarter-final stage. After all that travelling, we can now have a brief rest at home. Had England not had problems with FIFA in the early days, we could well have seen us lift the trophy a couple of times in the 30s. But as time's gone on, the rest of the world has caught up with the fathers of football, and we've only managed to reach one final in our 16 World Cup appearances. Luckily, that one final came on home soil in 1966 after beating Argentina and Portugal. 2 Jeff Hurst goals in extra time gave England a 4-2 victory over West Germany. Nearly 60 years later, I think it's about time we lifted that trophy again. The last of the 7 World Cup winners in this list, and the most recent ones, is Argentina. Much like England, we could have seen Argentina win more World Cups had they not refused to play from 1938 to 1954, but in the real world, they had to wait until 1978 to lift their first trophy after beating the Netherlands in the final in Buenos Aires. Maradona's hand of God would help them on their way to their second title 8 years later, and in Qatar, they beat France on penalties in probably the most thrilling final the World Cup has ever seen. With an aging squad, it seems a tough ask for Argentina to retain the title, but they are still sitting top of the world rankings. In 1998, Jamaica became the 3rd Caribbean nation to play at a World Cup after edging out Costa Rica to 3rd place in the final round of CONCACAF qualifying. In a very aesthetically pleasing group of Argentina, Croatia and Japan, they managed 3 points. To date, that's their only appearance at a World Cup, but as they ranked 4th in North America, we could very well see them return next time round. Nestled between 2 of the greatest footballing nations on earth, Andorra have just 4 World Cup qualifying wins to their name. 2 of those came against, you guessed it, San Marino in 2022, leaving them with a record points tally of 6. Chad have basically the same flag as Andorra, and they've had similar luck in World Cup qualifying. In 2018, they scraped past Sierra Leone on away goals in the first round and then managed to beat Egypt 1-0 in the first leg of round 2. Conceding 4 in the return leg would knock them out, however, as Egypt went on to qualify for the World Cup in Russia. No team has attempted to qualify for more World Cups without success than Luxembourg. After their first campaign in 1934, 20 World Cups later, they managed to win more than one game for the first time. An 85th minute goal in Ireland and 2 wins over Azerbaijan gave them a respectable 9 points. Currently at 86th in the world, it's not out of the question for them to sneak their way in for the next World Cup. 2 places above them in 84th sits Gabon, who have started off the current qualifying campaigns with 2 wins out of 2. In 2010, they just edged out Libya on goal difference to advance to a tough final round group where 4 points was all that separated them and Cameroon in first. Before the turn of the century, Portugal had only qualified for a measly 2 World Cup finals, but they've qualified for all 6 since. And apart from Belgium, they're the highest ranked team in the world never to win a World Cup. On 2 occasions though, they have reached the semi-finals. In 1966, that came after an incredible 5-3 comeback win against North Korea, only to fall to a 2-1 defeat to eventual winners England. 40 years later, they would get revenge by beating England on penalties, but would once again be defeated in the semis. The Christmas tree on Lebanon's flag may have been an omen, as the closest they've come to qualifying for a World Cup came in 2022, the only edition to partly take place in December. After advancing to the final round as one of the 5 best runners-up of round 2, the firepower of Iran and South Korea were simply too much for them, and they finished 6 points off the playoff place. Although they enjoyed some success in the most recent AFCON, Cape Verde have never qualified for a World Cup. But in 2022, they could have gone to a final playoff match if they beat Nigeria in the last round of fixtures. Unfortunately, a 1-1 draw left them 2 points short, and their wait for a World Cup appearance continues. Wrapping up the British Isles is Northern Ireland, who, despite a far smaller population than the Republic of Ireland, have qualified for just as many World Cups. The first of those came in 1958, where they had to win a playoff match against Czechoslovakia after finishing with the same number of points, and that sent them through to a quarter-final against France. They conceded 4 goals without reply, and they're yet to reach the same stage of any subsequent tournament. Liechtenstein fills in the final little European dot for us, and apart from San Marino, they're the lowest ranked European team at 203rd in the world. Their only 2 World Cup qualifying wins came in 2006 in what was quite an incredible campaign. Not only did they smash Luxembourg 3-0 and 4-0, but they also picked up points at home against Portugal and Slovakia. Their total of 13 goals in 12 games is pretty bloody good, considering their population of only 30-odd thousand. In 1994, Madagascar nearly got very lucky as Tanzania's withdrawal annulled both of Zambia's wins over them. That put Madagascar 2 points ahead going into the final game, so all they had to do was avoid defeat to advance to the final round, but a 3-1 loss ended their hopes of qualifying. Australia's cultural influence has caused rugby league and Aussie rules to be far more popular than normal football in Papua New Guinea, but the sheer size of their population compared to the other Oceanian nations means that they are one of the better teams in the region. Last time round was probably the closest they've come to qualifying, as they were defeated 3-2 by the Solomon Islands in the semi-final. As the lowest ranked side in continental Southeast Asia, Laos have just 3 World Cup qualifying wins to their name. One of those came after falling to a 4-2 defeat in the first leg against Cambodia, when in the second leg they won 6-2 after extra time. In the next round, China absolutely obliterated them 13-3 on aggregate, and they've already failed to qualify for the 2026 World Cup after losing 2-1 to Nepal in the first round. Jordan are one of the highest ranked Asian teams yet to qualify. In 2014, they beat Uzbekistan 9-8 on penalties to go through to the Interconfederation playoff with Uruguay, who finished 5th in South America. The game was pretty much already over after the first leg, as they fell to a 5-0 defeat at home. A poor draw in Montevideo meant Jordan had to watch the World Cup in Brazil from home. For some reason, Kazakhstan decided to switch to UEFA after the 2002 World Cup, where, predictably, they've not come anywhere near as close to qualification as when they were an AFC side. Their first attempt in 1998 led them to the final round, where they ended up 7 points short of Japan in the playoff place. Since the switch to UEFA, they've only seen 3 wins in 50 games. The last Oceania nation on this list, and the first to enter World Cup qualifying after Australia and New Zealand, is Fiji, who were in Australia's group during their famous 31-0 win over American Samoa. Fiji joins the Aussies in making absolute mincemeat of the rest of the opposition. They beat American Samoa 13-0, Samoa 6-1 and Tonga 8-1. The only game of any importance in this group was the one against Australia, which they lost 2-0. If they won, I think Fiji would have had a real chance of beating New Zealand in the next round, but evidently things weren't to be. Our last African team is one of the lowest ranked to have ever qualified. In 2006, they beat out Nigeria in the final round to win their ticket to Germany, where in Group D, they fell to a 1-0 defeat to their former colonial overlords in the first game, meaning their draws against Mexico and Iran weren't enough to see them advance to the knockout stage. Aruba have definitely fared worse than Curacao after the breakup of Netherlands Antilles, and they've absolutely plummeted down the world rankings in recent years, going from 112th in 2015 to 205th in 2021. Their best campaign probably came when they were awarded a win over Barbados after the latter fielded an ineligible player. In round 3, they couldn't overcome St. Vincent's 2-goal lead from the first leg and were knocked out. Sochin An, with his 219 caps for Malaysia, is the most capped international footballer of all time. Long after his retirement, Malaysia smashed Timor-Leste 12-2 on aggregate to advance to the second round of 2022 qualifying, where they were 5 points away from Vietnam in second, ended their campaign. Filling in the last spot in Asia is Mongolia, whose most popular sport is actually wrestling. Just like Malaysia, their best campaign came in 2022, where despite losing 14-0 at home to Japan, they picked up 2 wins against Kyrgyzstan and Myanmar. This year, they failed to even reach round 2 after being knocked out by Afghanistan. After 210 countries, we've finally come to the end with Dominica. A far inferior side to the Dominican Republic, one of their few World Cup qualifying wins came in 2014, 4-2 on aggregate against the Bahamas. With an unlucky draw in the next round, they couldn't do much apart from watch as they shipped 18 goals over the 2 legs against Mexico. So there you have it. Like I said in the previous video, there's bound to be some mistakes in a video this long, so feel free to correct me in the comments below. And if you want to chuck us a couple quid to support the channel, you can use the super thanks option or become a member using these buttons below. I'll be keeping a close eye on how the rest of qualification for the next World Cup goes, so subscribe here and give us a follow on Twitter if you want to stay up to date. I'd just like to thank Wikipedia and Tesco's finest Costa Rican coffee, without which this video couldn't have been made, and I'll see you all in a month's time, or a week, or a year, or 5, or just however long it takes basically. Bye.